Alright, welcome back everyone to another chapter of the DCS F-14 Tomcat for Dummies series. In this chapter, we will be taking a look at air combat for pilots. This chapter will contain lessons on the air-to-air symbology for the HUD, VDI, and TID, how to use the ACM panel, ACM modes, how to understand the RWR, and finally we will look at the countermeasures in the F-14. Hopefully, after learning these important lessons, you can go out there and demonstrate why the F-14 Tomcat was the US Navy's premier fleet defender for over 30 years. A few quick things to mention before we get into the video. First, I recently started using Twitter, so if you would like to follow me for real-time updates on this channel's content and for other military and aerospace content, then you can do so with the handle @PresDCS. Also, if you are looking for an opportunity to improve your air combat skills and join a good community of like-minded people, then consider joining the Alamo Aggressors Squadron. We are a dedicated PvP focus group that I run to participate in competitive events such as SATAL, SATAC, TACT, and House of SAR. So, if you're interested, then you can reach us by joining the Alamo Aggressors Discord with the link in the description. First things first. Let's talk about the air-to-air symbology you will find on the F-14's heads-up display. Now, the Tomcat's HUD is very simple. Still stuck in the age of analog computing, you will find that it lacks pretty much all the nice bells and whistles you find on more modern digital HUD interfaces. But that doesn't mean it's unusable. The first thing you'll find after hitting the air-to-air button on the display panel is the Armament Datum Line, or ADL Cross. This is just an old-school term for the bore sight. The ADL Cross is where pretty much all your sensors are slaved to by default. The AIM-9 Sidewinder Seeker will be looking here by default, as well as the television camera set. The radar is also focused around this point for the ACM modes, but we'll get to that later. Now, if you cycle through your weapons, you'll see some lettering and a number pop up at the bottom of the HUD, but if you'll notice, in this example, we have a very obvious X over the lettering. This is a HUD cue to let you know that your master arm is either off or in training mode. As far as the actual letters are concerned, for the gun, the letter displayed is a simple G with an accompanying number that relates to how much ammunition you have left in hundreds of rounds. So a 6 would be at or above 600 rounds of ammo. The AIM-9 Sidewinder is the next weapon and is displayed by the letters SW and its accompanying number of missiles. Then you have the AIM-7 Sparrow labeled SP, and finally the AIM-54 Phoenix labeled PH. Swinging back to the gun, when it's selected and there's no target locked by the radar, you'll get the real-time gun sight, or RTGS, which is an inertially calculated gun sight for freehanding the gun without a radar lock, and consists of 3 elements: the ADL Cross, the target diamond, and the pipper, also known as the movable reticle. The target diamond and the pipper will show you where your cannon rounds will land at a predetermined distance. The pipper relates to where your rounds will land at 1,000 feet of travel, and the target diamond is this same trajectory but at 2,000 feet of travel. This is all well and good, but what about when you actually acquire a radar lock? Well, the first 2 things you will notice are these brand new scales on either side of the HUD that will persist regardless of the weapon selected. The scale on the left is the closure scale, which is fixed and tops out at 1,000 knots and bottoms out at -200 knots. Each of these dot marks subdivides the scale by 200 knots each. The scale opposite that is the target range scale, with the max distance at the top, which will automatically change depending on the range from the target, and the bottom of the scale always being 0. The dot marks subdividing the scale into an easier to guess measurement. The range scale also comes with 2 dash marks, which are the weapon's engagement zone markers, with the top one being the maximum possible employment range and the bottom dash being the minimum employment range. Both the closure and range scale come with a target designator letting you know where your target lies on the scale. There is also one more persistent symbol that appears, but we'll get to that in a moment. As for the symbology relating specifically to the gun, we retain the diamond and the pipper. However, instead of the symbols relating to the position of your gun rounds at a given distance, the pipper is now placed on the HUD where the target needs to be for the gun rounds to hit based on the motion of you and the target, and the range between you and the target up to 4,000 feet. The diamond is now fixed atop the radar target, and this feature is persistent across all weapons. So when going for a gun kill, all you need to do is place the pipper on top of the target diamond and let it rip. Also, you may see this big X symbol flash over the witch hat from time to time. This is the breakaway symbol, letting you know you are inside the minimum employment zone for the weapon. From there, we have slightly different symbology for air-to-air missiles. As said before, the target diamond persists as the location of the radar target on the HUD, which will help you greatly in beyond visual range situations. The main change is that now, instead of being a calculated lead point, the pipper is now where the television camera set is currently looking. Normally, it will be slaved to the radar target and show as these spikes on the corner of the target diamond, but sometimes it can separate from the target or be present without a radar target at all. This often happens during missile deployment when a belly-mounted Sparrow or Phoenix flies in front of the television camera set shortly after launch. The very last bit of symbology to be aware of is for when you're in track while scan auto. In this case, and with radar contacts being tracked, you will see a small upside-down T-shaped symbol on the HUD. This is the steering cue for the automatically generated centroid if you'll remember back to Chapter 3 of this series. You'll want to point your nose directly at this point when taking Phoenix shots in TWS to keep the scan centered on all the targets during employment. Now that you know how to read the HUD for weapons employment, let's talk about how to make these weapons ready. Directly beneath the HUD is the ACM panel. Starting on the right side is the all-important master arm switch, which features a safety cover that must be lifted prior to pushing the lever into the on position. Closing the cover while the switch is in the on position will bring it back into the off position. You can also put the switch into a training mode, but this pretty much has no use other than being another off position that you can flip to even while the cover is down. Moving on over to the left, we have the missile step button. This allows you to change the behavior of your radar-guided missiles. By default, this is set to norm, but by pressing the button, you can set your missiles to bore sight mode, which for the Sparrow allows you to shoot without a lock and instead use the flood antennas on the nose of the jet. These antennas essentially act as a flashlight in the event you lose lock with the target or are in bore sight mode, and will have the Sparrow track off the strongest radar return in the flood antenna beam. This beam is centered around the ADL cross, so if you fear you may lose track with the Sparrow or don't have time for a lock, then you just keep the ADL cross on the target until the missile fails or you hit your target. Also, for the AIM-54 Phoenix, this will change your missiles from being radar guided to being active off the rail, otherwise known as Mad Dog. Moving on from there, we have these three buttons at the top. From left to right, these are the gun rate, sidewinder cooling, and missile prep buttons. The gun rate button allows the pilot to toggle between 4,000 and 6,000 rounds per minute for the M61 cannon. Typically, you'd want the gun to be in the low setting for strafe and ground targets and the high setting for things like dogfighting, but it's really just preference. You'll be dumping a lot of lead either way. The sidewinder cooling button activates and deactivates the cooling of the AIM-9 Seekers. In real life, you couldn't keep the missiles on cool forever as they would run out of cooling, especially on the older models of the Sidewinder. But this issue is not currently modeled in the game, so you are free to have it on all the time. It's important to know that when the Sidewinder cooling is off, you will not be able to get a Seeker lock and there will be no tone for the missile. The nice thing is that it takes up to 60 seconds for the Seeker to spool up completely, and you can actually hear this happen. So on or off, just make sure not to forget to activate it when necessary. The last button is the missile prep button. Similar to the Sidewinder cooling button, the radar-guided missiles also required cooling and external power for the electronics to operate. In real life, F-14s actually had tanks of coolant dedicated to the AIM-54. Eventually, these would not be necessary for the Phoenix with the creation of the AIM-54C sealed round, but we don't have that version of the AIM-54 in DCS. The important thing to note about this button is that it will take up to 2 minutes for the electronics and gyros to be properly spun up before the missiles can be used, so keep that in mind. But again, the issue of running out of coolant or burning out the missile's electronics is not currently modeled in DCS, so you can pretty much leave these on from the moment you start up the jet. Below these buttons, we have the master caution light and button, so if there's ever a problem, just ignore it and push this button. You'll be fine. Further below this is the turn and slip indicator, which isn't really something necessary to cover unless you're looking to do some real precision flying. Continuing on to the left are the annunciator lights for a few things. The top one is the seam lock light, which, if you'll remember from Chapter 5, indicates that you have acquired a positive seam lock after hitting the uncage button for the AIM-9 Sidewinder. Next is the collision steering light, letting you know that the Rio has selected a collision steering calculation for the lead when using a single target track. Normally, the F-14's lead cue is for weapons employment, but this can be changed to assist in intercepting a target's flight path. Finally, there is the hot trigger light, which will let you know that your selected weapon is ready to be launched when the master arm is on. Further to the left of these lights is the ACM jettison button along with the ACM cover. Flipping this cover up will expose the ACM jettison button and, at the same time, turn your Sidewinder cooling and missile prep on and move the gun rate to high if these options weren't already selected. Now, for the ACM jettison button, it will only eject anything that the Rio has selected on the armament panel in the back seat. So don't worry about punching this button and thinking everything will just fall off. The Rio has to also give consent. The very last thing to talk about on the ACM panel is the station status flags at the very bottom of the panel. Now, these are pretty tough to see, but for reference, a white indicator means that the station is currently loaded, a black indicator means that the station is empty, and a checkered flag means that the station is currently selected for operation. Now that you've got the knowledge on how to ready your weapons with the ACM panel, let's talk about how to use the ACM radar modes. These modes are the only way for the pilot to manually control the radar from the front, and each has its own specific use case. The 4 radar modes are PAL, PLM, VSL High, and VSL Low. Now, there is a 5th mode that only the Rio can use, but it's not important to talk about here. Each of these modes will generate a pulse single target track upon acquiring a target. The Pilot Automatic Lock-On mode, or PAL for short, is a short-range super search function of the AUG-9 radar, with a range of around 15 nautical miles against fighter-sized targets. The PAL mode conducts a rapid 8-bar sweep covering 20 degrees left and right of the nose of the jet, which can be seen with the target diamond rapidly sweeping across the HUD. PAL will lock up the first thing it sees, whether or not it was the target you wanted, so be careful when using it. It's also quite a slow scan, so it's best kept to being used for the transition into visual range combat. Pilot Lock-On mode, or PLM, is a manual bore sight lock type that requires the pilot to place the ADL cross over the target and then press and hold the PLM button until a lock is achieved. This mode has a range of about 5 nautical miles. This acquisition mode is extremely useful for when you have visual contact with the target and it's not maneuvering very much, making this kind of lock easy to acquire. The next 2 modes are the same except for where they scan. These are the vertical scan lock-on high and low, or VSL high and VSL low. They are both automatic scans like PAL, except they scan a very narrow slice of the sky, and both have a max range of about 5 nautical miles. For VSL low, this is a 5-degree wide scan that looks 15 degrees below and 25 degrees above the ADL cross. VSL high, on the other hand, scans 15 degrees above to 55 degrees above the ADL cross. Because of this scan being so high above the HUD, you will not be able to actually see the scan take place, so you'll just have to trust that it's working. VSL low should be the primary ACM mode you use in dogfights, at least in my opinion, because it fulfills the role of PLM, however more versatile, while also providing it in an automatic fashion. VSL high should be used in situations where the target is way above the canopy bow, such as in a rate fight or when trying to bring the nose onto a target after a high aspect merge. The Vertical Display Indicator, or VDI, is a virtual recreation of the HUD, which adds additional information to assist the pilot in flying and aerial combat. The VDI also functions as another attitude indicator to complement the standby one on the instrument panel. The VDI is also where you can get the television camera set feed to make beyond visual range identifications. To activate this, you will need to flip the TV norm mode switch on the display panel under the VDI switch options. Clicking on the display with your mouse will also change it between a green daytime mode and red nighttime mode. On to the combat symbology, we pretty much get something of a fusion between the HUD symbology and the TID symbology during an engagement. The first thing to notice is the range scale that moves across the VDI based on the azimuth location of the target. On the left side of the scale is the relative position of the target, and on the right side are the 2 employment zone dashes that mirror the caret and hash marks on the HUD's range scale. Along with the range scale, we have the upside down T symbol that we see during a Twiz auto track on the HUD. However, we will get this steering cue in TWS as well as single target track on the VDI. You will also receive a Weapons Employment Zone circle, or WEZ circle, that will appear whenever you have entered the maximum aerodynamic range of your selected weapon, and it will increase in size until pretty much engulfing the entire VDI when you have entered the maximum optimal range of the selected weapon. The circle also doubles as an allowable steering cue, so as long as the T-shaped steering cue is inside the WEZ circle, you will be within acceptable launch parameters. Now, on the TID TID during a single target track, you will get similar symbology to help during weapons employment, namely the WES circle showing you that you are in range and the T-shaped steering cue that is now represented by a hollow square. Unlike the VDI, these cues will only appear on the TID during a single target track. Before we move on, I want to share a tip with you guys to help when performing a crank maneuver in the Tomcat. Unlike other aircraft like the F-16, which shows the antenna train angle on the HUD, or the F-15 that makes the crank easier with its B-scope style radar screen, cranking can be quite tough during an STT lock, as it's hard to tell just how close you are to breaking the gimbal limits of the AUG-9. So when performing a crank in the F-14 during an STT, if you line up this T-shaped steering cue on the VDI so that it sits nicely between the witch hat and the hash mark on the edge of the screen, this will come out to just about a perfect 45-degree crank angle off the target in level flight, and will obviously increase if you add a vertical element to the crank. If you're able to maintain this during the crank, it should allow you to hold an STT lock on the opponent with relative ease. The AN ALR-67 radar warning receiver is an upgrade over the Tomcat's original AN ALR-45 and AN ALR-50 RWR systems, which have yet to be introduced to DCS. The AN ALR-67 features its own display system that can be located on the top right-hand side of the front instrument panel. First, let's talk about how the RWR in the Tomcat has been modeled, because it's probably the most realistically modeled RWR in DCS at the time I'm making this. The way the RWR receives signals is through 1 low frequency and 4 high frequency antenna receivers located on the left and right intakes and on the horizontal stabilizers in the tail section. So when the RWR displays an incoming signal, it's displayed based on which antenna is receiving first. However, because of this, often you may find yourself receiving multiple duplicate signals displayed on the RWR display, as the AN ALR-67 is unable to accurately process which antenna is receiving the signal first. This problem only really occurs during rapid maneuvering in the case of something like missile defense. So now that we've talked about how it works, let's talk about how to actually read the display. Unlike the more advanced digital displays, which can show a signal based on its approximate signal strength, the AN ALR-67 is a fully analog display system that can only display signals based on their bearing position and their threat type. The display has 3 threat rings with a central mode display ring letting you know what the priority radar types are. This in particular is controlled by the RIO. Now, the first innermost ring will display non-threatening radars such as search radars and early warning radars like that of an AWACS aircraft, or radars whose signal strength is too low to be considered a threat. The second middle ring is where threat radars will be displayed, or radars that are close enough to be deemed within threatening range. The outermost ring is for radars that are currently targeting or even actively engaging you. Things like a radar spike, launching of semi-active missiles, or lock from an active radar-guided missile will appear here. It's also important to note that radars that are actively engaging you will start blinking to let you know which one is actually shooting at you, because you may have times where multiple radars are locking you up. The other aspect of the AN ALR-67 is that it provides the crew with audio cues to let you know what is happening the moment it happens. The first audio tone is that of the new emitter tone, which is a short tone to alert the crew of a new radar being detected. The next is a slow, continuous warbling tone that alerts the crew of a radar currently locking them. The last sound is a sped up version of the previous tone to alert the crew they are actively being engaged by a radar-guided weapon. Final bit of info for the F-14's RWR are the 3 warning lights for the pilot located on the right side of the HUD, which will light up whenever you're being targeted and flash whenever you're being engaged to further assist you in identifying the threat type engaging you. SAM, or SAM, for surface-to-air missiles, AAA for anti-air artillery, and AI for airborne intercept radars. Now let's talk a bit about the countermeasures available for the F-14. As far as being a pilot is concerned, you will only have one button available to deploy countermeasures, and this button doubles as your DLC activation button as well. A single countermeasure will be expended per button push. By default, you will only have access to flares as the pilot, while the RIO will have access to both chaff and flares, along with being able to create and activate countermeasure programs. You can, however, change the available countermeasures through the comms menu at the top left of the screen. screen by hitting \, selecting the F8 ground crew option, selecting the F6 AN ALE 39 loadout option, and finally choosing what combination of chaff and flares you would like to have in the AN ALE 39 countermeasure pod. Keep in mind, this will not replace the chaff you already have in the jet, it will just replace the flares. So you can have any combination of chaff and flares with a total of 60 cartridges. Now it depends on what you expect to use more in your missions, but my recommendation is that you don't really need to change this. As it currently stands, chaff really isn't all that useful to defeat incoming radar guided missiles, except in the case of the Razbam Mirage 2000, which actually does get noticeably affected by chaff on its radar. You already have 40 chaff cartridges by default, so it's your choice to increase that. Alright, that about does it for this chapter of the DCS F-14 Tomcat for Dummies series. In the next chapter, we will be taking a close look at how to conduct air combat for the Rio seat and talk about a few tips to help out in the back seat. So if you enjoyed the video and want to support the channel, then leave a like and subscribe to the channel if you haven't already. If you have any questions or other remarks, please feel free to leave them in the comments section and I'll be sure to answer them. Also, if there's anything I missed or anything that you would like expanded upon in a future edition to this series, please do so in the comments section as well. With all that out of the way, I want to thank you all for watching, and have a nice day.